From the global stage to the kitchen table. When international security becomes a household burden. The pursuit of global security does not culminate in dramatic news footage of missile launches or aggressive military drills. Instead, it seeps silently into our daily lives, manifesting through grocery receipts, fuel prices, and the interest rates on household loans worldwide. Every time geopolitical tensions escalate, military budgets tend to surge in their wake. In many cases, states must incur greater debt to sustain these rising security costs. Financial markets respond with volatility, currencies fluctuate, and energy costs climb. Ultimately, these burdens do not stop at the figures in a budget report. They flow back to the people in the form of an unavoidable rise in the cost of living. What appears to be a distant matter on the global stage thus becomes a personal crisis, at every dining table an undeniable reality for all. In the grand scheme, the global security system is an arena for superpowers players who possess the authority to set the rules, control the flow of capital, and dictate the structure of world trade. A single decision by a major power, whether increasing a defense budget, declaring sanctions, imposing tariffs, or forming military alliances, can automatically trigger a chain reaction through energy markets, financial systems, and global supply chains. Small nations have little power to steer the game, but bear the full brunt of these shifts. When global energy prices rise, importing nations must shoulder the cost. When interest rates in global financial centers climb, capital flows out, local currencies weaken, import costs soar, and national budgets tighten. What is described as the global security strategy of superpowers is thus gradually reshaped into budgetary constraints, fiscal austerity, and unavoidable economic pressure at the national level. In other words, the global stage may be the start of the cycle, but the destination is always the quality of life of the people. The question that should be asked as loudly as any explosion is, who is truly making the decisions, and who, in the end, is paying the price? The start of the cycle, when geopolitics answers domestic failures. Before discussing war or global geopolitics, it is necessary to trace back to one of the roots of this momentum: the performance failures of leaders within major powers themselves. In practice, external security issues are often elevated during times when internal stability is faltering. When the economy slows, wages stagnate against the cost of living, household debt skyrockets, social opportunities shrink, and the younger generation loses faith that the system can provide a better future, discontent begins to brew silently, accumulating into direct political pressure on leaders. The question is, how do we observe when a country's administration is failing? The signs are not found in rhetoric, but are reflected in the numbers and the lived experiences of the people. Real wages stagnate or decline relative to inflation. Public services deteriorate. Healthcare and education budgets are slashed. Infrastructure is neglected. Wealth and income inequality continue to widen, while approval ratings suffer a chronic decline. These are reflections of the loss of performance legitimacy, a cornerstone of legitimacy in modern political systems. When performance can no longer serve as sufficient evidence to justify power, leaders face a difficult choice. One option is to admit failure and undertake structural reforms, which are often painful, time-consuming, and risky for those in power. Another option, frequently seen throughout history, is to shift the political arena entirely, moving from a field measured by economic indicators and quality of life to one measured by national survival. In the realm of security, oversight is often diminished, and fear can foster unity far more quickly than economic reform. Thus, the most systemic sleight of hand is not merely distorting figures, but attempting to shift the axis of legitimacy from domestic management to external threat creation. Once a threat is made large enough, questions about income, the cost of living, or inequality are automatically deprioritized. In an atmosphere where the nation is perceived to be in danger, calls for accountability are easily branded as subversions of national security. At that point, the cycle of securitization begins to spin at full force, built upon a foundation of internal failures that were never truly addressed. The mechanism of securitization. When a political issue is rapidly elevated into securitization, the atmosphere of normal debate vanishes instantly. The space for oversight narrows, executive power expands, and those who dare to question risk being labeled as unpatriotic or obstacles to the state's safety. To visualize this mechanism most clearly, consider the hypothetical case of a restaurant owner whose poor cooking and management have caused sales to plummet, a loss of performance legitimacy. If the owner continues as usual, they will surely go out of business. But instead of learning new recipes or improving the system, they choose to stand in the middle of the shop and shout, "The competitor next door is secretly poisoning our ingredients." The moment this claim is released, the worldview of some customers shifts. Attention is no longer on the terrible taste of the food but focuses on the survival of the shop. Customers who once criticized the owner may turn to support them to protect the shop from a phantom threat. This is the same mechanism by which some superpowers shift their role from a failing global manager to a heroic world protector, using fear as a shield to diminish criticism and halt all oversight. Definitions and responses. The role of small nations. However, the picture described above is the context of superpowers, the players who set the rhythm of the game and send tremors through the world system. When those tremors reach the national level, especially for countries that do not set the rules, the key question shifts from who started the game to who must deal with its consequences. Governments in each country face external pressure alongside internal fragility. They cannot remain still. They must choose how to define the situation. Will they call it mere economic volatility, a structural risk, or will they elevate it to a national threat to mobilize resources and state power? This decision is a critical crossroads, as it dictates the direction of policy, budget, and internal political space. In other words, global context is the push, but the definition and response at the national level are the mechanisms that determine whether the security cycle expands or is contained. This is where we must consider how leaders, faced with pressure from all sides, choose to move their pieces and why securitization has become the most powerful tool in the state's hand. Lessons from reality. How different nations define national threats. The process of securitization does not follow a single template. What each country chooses to define as a threat reflects its geopolitical context, economic structure, and internal vulnerabilities. The more we understand how they define threats, the clearer we see how security is used as a strategic and political tool. The United States, terrorism and systemic threats to global order after 9/11. The U.S. defined transnational terrorism as an existential threat to national security. The response was not limited to hunting terrorist groups, but expanded into wars across multiple regions, increased intelligence powers, internal security laws, and continuous defense budget expansions. The result was a threat made to feel endless, since terrorism is not a state that can clearly surrender, giving rise to forever wars. Later, the definition of threat expanded to great power competition, viewing certain nations as structural threats to the U.S.-led order. This brought security to cover everything from 5G technology and semiconductors to supply chains and cross-border investments. The threat is no longer just on the battlefield but embedded in the digital economy and the global financial system. Japan, regional uncertainty and structural fragility. Japan defines threats in two layers. The first is geopolitical, arising from the security environment in East Asia, such as neighboring military capabilities or tensions in various straits. This serves as justification for increasing defense budgets and reinterpreting the Constitution regarding national defense. The deeper layer is the threat of structural stagnation within its domestic economy. Facing an aging society, high public debt, and low growth, Japan needs to stimulate new industrial sectors. Defense technology and security cooperation thus become both strategic tools and economic mechanisms. External threats are thus seamlessly merged with internal economic necessity. Israel and Iran. Identity threats and a state of siege. Both nations define threats as existential threats. Israel focuses on threats from militant groups and states that do not recognize its legitimacy, while Iran focuses on the threat of encirclement, sanctions, and external interference. Under this framework, security is not just one policy among many but the core of the state. When a threat is framed as a matter of survival, the state can more easily expand security powers, surveillance, and internal control. Questioning the military or security budgets may be interpreted as undermining the nation's survival. The threat thus becomes a permanent mechanism for organizing society and domestic politics. Switzerland and Finland. Threats of superpower intervention. These nations define threats simply but seriously: the risk of being dragged into superpower conflicts. Historical experience led them to choose armed neutrality. Threats are not used to constantly agitate the public, but are translated into long-term investment in national defense, troop training, and crisis-ready infrastructure. The key concept is deterrence, making the cost of invasion so high that it is not worthwhile. Instead of relying solely on moral declarations of neutrality, their neutrality carries weight because it is backed by capability. Singapore. The threat of irrelevance for Singapore. Threat is defined not just militarily, but includes the threat of being overlooked in the global economic system. A small nation without large natural resources can be easily pressured if it lacks a vital role in global supply chains, finance, or logistics. Thus, rather than expanding a rhetoric of fear, Singapore builds strategic necessity, making itself a hub for finance, shipping, and regional management. When a country holds a role that the world depends on, the threat of being squeezed automatically decreases. Security is thus defined through economics more than the military. Vietnam. The threat of one-sided dependency. Vietnam defines threat as the loss of sovereignty from over-reliance on any single superpower. Historical lessons have made diversification of both security and economic relations the core strategy. Vietnam maintains military ties with one side to balance power while actively opening trade with another. Threat here is not just military invasion but structural risk from unbalanced dependency. Strategic hedging thus becomes the heart of national security. The security cycle and the burden borne by the people. Data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, indicates that global military spending in 2023 reached $2.44 trillion. This figure reflects that massive resources are being allocated to the security sector. Under the security industrial complex concept, networks between the military, corporate groups, and banks in some countries may support each other through budgets that may generate more public debt than direct economic return. When the state must spend more, the choices are few: raise taxes, incur debt, or expand the money base. Whichever path is chosen, the repercussions eventually return to the people's cost of living. Security at the state level is not a distant matter, but is directly linked to daily life. Pushing the public to pick a side. What makes this cycle even more powerful is the discursive arrangement that often pushes the public to pick a side. We are encouraged to cheer for the side that aligns with our beliefs or identity. Some cheer for freedom, some for sovereignty, some out of a dislike for the opposition. But while we debate fiercely, we often fail to ask simple questions. How will the conflict we are cheering for affect our country, our society, and our families? Will fuel prices rise? Will mortgage rates go up? Will public budgets be diverted from welfare to weaponry? Being obsessed with picking a side can divert attention from the real costs that we all must pay together. For small nations, this situation is even more fragile because shocks from superpower conflicts are transmitted quickly through energy prices, financial markets, and global trade. However, governments do not have the power to control the economy so precisely as to perfectly dictate outcomes, as some believe. What happens more often is that when the economy tightens, people must use all their energy just to survive. The space for political participation naturally shrinks. Pressure for structural reform may weaken on its own. Monitoring the use of superpower and domestic political power becomes difficult for citizens caught in the survival trap. The economic structure and social pressure result in a state of atomization, where society is so fragmented that there may be no intellectual capital left to question true power. The lives of many workers reflect this clearly. Waking up early, braving traffic, working hard all day, and then needing a side hustle after work to cope with the rising cost of living leaves almost no time or energy to monitor state budgets or understand deep geopolitics. When most people are running in a cycle of survival, the cycle of expanding state security can move forward with less resistance. Creating balance in a volatile world. In a world where many superpowers use security rhetoric as a tool to maintain their influence, small nations face a complex challenge. They cannot allow themselves to become mere pawns on the board, but neither can they ignore the risks surrounding them. The solution is not to reject security entirely, nor to pour all resources into the military until the country's structure is distorted. Instead, it is about designing a multi-layered balance that makes the state flexible enough to handle external pressure without allowing fear to become a permanent internal control mechanism. The first layer of this balance is making the country possess structural value to the world system. A small nation may not compete in military might, but can create weight through economic roles, technology, finance, energy, or logistics. The more vital a country is to supply chains or regional infrastructure, the higher the cost for any party to pressure, coerce, or destabilize it. Economic importance thus acts as a systemic shield building security through connectivity rather than confrontation. Making the world unable to easily do without us carries more power than declaring political stances without a supporting base. The second layer is strategic diversification. A country that ties its trade, technology, or security future to only one superpower is automatically in a fragile position. Maintaining relationships with multiple power centers is not indecisiveness, it is risk management in a multipolar world. When no single country holds all the cards, the bargaining power of a small state increases immediately. This flexibility helps reduce the chance that external issues will be used as internal pressure tools because the state still has choices and room to maneuver. The third layer is having the capability to defend oneself at a level that forces any aggressor to calculate the cost before acting. This includes basic military capability, cybersecurity, energy security, or the ability to handle economic crises. The goal is not an arms race, but creating conditions where intervention is too costly to be worthwhile. At the same time, such capabilities must remain under a transparent, accountable budget system and not be used as an excuse for the executive branch to expand power indefinitely. Security is thus managed as a type of public policy, not a sacred space that cannot be touched. The results do not stop at their own borders. When a superpower decides to elevate an issue to a threat, the results do not stop at their own borders. Sanctions, tariffs, technology restrictions, or military movements create ripples across global supply chains, financial markets, and energy prices. The heart of the problem is not just how often someone uses the term national threat, but making the invocation of such threats carry an international cost. Every time tension is expanded, the impact is passed to countries that had no part in the decision. Ultimately, it ends with ordinary households who must deal with higher fuel prices, more expensive food, and more volatile interest rates without ever having a vote in that game. Globally, the security of one superpower often means the uncertainty of many other nations. When trade routes change, capital flows out, currencies fluctuate, or goods become scarce, small nations that rely on imports and exports find it hard to avoid the impact. When the internal economy is squeezed by external shocks, the burden falls on the people. Workers face a decrease in real income. Small business owners shoulder higher costs. Households must reallocate budgets just to survive. In such a situation, the energy and time to participate in public affairs fade away. The space for debate narrows not because people don't care about politics, but because they must devote all their energy to sustaining their daily lives. Global and national conditions are thus inextricably linked. If a country lacks sufficient economic importance, trade diversity, or the capability to absorb external shocks, the results of superpower decisions will be even more severe and rapid. Fragility will multiply. Social pressure will rise even though the cause did not originate from the policies of the people in that country, but from a power struggle thousands of kilometers away. The weaker the internal structure, the more external tremors exacerbate internal inequality and economic insecurity. If this dynamic continues without balance at the global and national levels, the cycle usually looks the same. Tensions between superpowers rise. Economic countermeasures expand. Global markets fluctuate. Security budgets of many nations soar. Fiscal burdens increase. Resources that should be used for social development are diverted. When state spending shifts, inequality tends to expand. Household fragility accumulates. Then, when economic and social problems erupt, they may be explained by a new round of threat rhetoric. The cycle thus repeats on a broader scale. Those who bear the cost first are the citizens who were never in the meeting rooms of any superpower. Therefore, the question more important than picking a side in the conflicts of major nations is how to make the state and economic structures of small countries capable of absorbing external shocks, without letting geopolitical tremors automatically transform into a cost of living crisis at the household level. In a world where superpower decisions affect across borders unavoidably, the true challenge is creating a system that protects ordinary people from the consequences of power competition, a competition they never started but are always forced to pay for.